Well, I want to thank the organizers for putting Dan and his colleagues on the program. They are an exceptionally creative and skilled set of young economists who are producing a set of really innovative studies on the economic impact of Social Security and disability insurance, this paper being one. This is actually this is both a tough paper and a policy relevant paper. This is a policy relevant in the following sense, is that the earnings test is one of the tools that helps us strike a balance between benefits earning and savings in the provision of retirement income. But this is a tough topic as well, because when studying the retirement earnings test, economists tend to look where the light is, and we focused almost all of our efforts on evaluating ex post actual reforms to the earnings test. Now, those reforms have done things like changed the threshold amount. We've looked at changes in the benefit reduction rate and changes in eligibility in and of itself. The other feature of the previous literature, some of which has been done by people in the room, is that that it is focused, these reforms have focused inevitably on people who have been 65 years and older. And this paper has a much different focus. This is about what is the impact of the retirement earnings test on individuals who are 62 to 64 years old. That is individuals who are entitled to claiming early retirement benefits. And they're really, one could argue that since the enactment of the 1961 and 1965 amendments to the Social Security Act, that the structure of the earnings test that applies to 62 to 64-year-olds has essentially been unchanged. So you have the following situation. You want to evaluate the retirement earnings test on 62 to 64-year-olds, but there's been no policy variation. And if you do the type of reduced form work that Dan does and I do, this is really challenging, because typically that's what we identify, how we identify the causal impacts of policies, by looking at changes in these policies that occur across groups over time. So in order to better understand Dan's results, let me just frame for you the empirical strategy that Dan is doing. So let's start for the moment. Let's imagine we could do a randomized controlled trial, which is the gold standard in the sciences and social sciences for estimating causal impacts of policies. In that case, what would we do? We would take a group of 62 to 64-year-olds, and we would randomly assign them to treatment and control groups. The treatment group would be subject to the earnings test, and the control group would not. Then we would simply go and we'd measure various labor supply outcomes, such as employment, earnings, and hours, and we would do a comparison of the outcome behavior between the treatment and control groups, and that would give us our impact estimates of the effect of the earnings test on labor supply outcomes. To the extent that randomization was done appropriately, we would deem those as being causal estimates, because what randomization would do was ensure comparability between the treatment and control groups in terms of their underlying preferences for work and their ex-ante future trajectories of employment. So that's the gold standard. Now, unfortunately, we don't run randomized controlled trials to determine Social Security policy, although I'm sure there's some people in this room who wish that we could or that we would. But what we can do is we can try to mimic that as close as possible to try to develop empirical strategies to identify these effects. So this is what Dan did. What Dan has done is he's basically defined treatment and control groups by looking at individuals who would otherwise be just above and just below the threshold amounts, the threshold levels, who would earn just above and below the threshold levels in their early 60s. And the way he defines that is by looking at what your earnings are essentially in your late 50s. Okay, so, and what he wants to do, so the treatment group are individuals who are just above the threshold amount, control group individuals are people who are below the threshold amount, and then essentially you proceed as if it's a randomized controlled trial. There are two key assumptions in using this method. The first is that above threshold earners tend to continue to be above threshold earners. That's what Dan called persistence, and he showed those with the histograms. And below threshold earners continue to be, on average, tend to be below threshold earners. The second assumption is that these two groups are, at least if you thought about it as a narrow band around the threshold amount, these two groups would otherwise be very similar in terms of their underlying preferences to work and their ex-ante future trajectories of employment. So the idea is that in the absence of the earnings test, these groups would have employment trajectories that would evolve similarly over time. If we later, down the road, 3, 4, 5 years, as Dan explained, see those trajectories diverging, where the employment drops more for the high exposure group than the low exposure group, then we would attribute that as a causal impact of the earnings test. So those are the two really key assumptions. If you believe those assumptions, then basically Dan's method mimics as close as possible the randomized controlled trial without being one as a randomization by design. So to recap Dan's basic results, using data from 1978 to 1987, Dan finds that the retirement earnings test is associated with a 8 percentage point reduction in the employment rate of 62 to 64-year-olds. Now, with the adjustments that Dan talked about, we get that down to maybe 4 percentage points. If you want a sense of comparison, there have been some studies, there have been a number of studies of the abolition of the earnings test for those individuals 65 and older that occurred in calendar year 2000. And if you kind of average the estimates across those studies, they're in the same ballpark. So I do not find Dan's estimates to be implausible. And Dan is very careful, Dan and his co-authors are very careful to do a large set of robustness checks to really confirm those basic estimates. As this research progresses, there are a number of things I would like to see going forward. The first is that the 8 percentage point decline in the employment rate, or the 4 percentage point, however you want to think about it, that's one that applies to the group of all workers. Now, what we know about the earnings test, it only applies to Social Security beneficiaries, who are going to ultimately be a smaller subset of the sample based on the estimation. So you have a full sample estimate of an 8 percentage point decline in employment from the earnings test. But it ultimately only applies to a smaller sample. So I would like to see those actually scaled. That's what we would call treatment on the treated in the program evaluation literature. And to give a sense of how important this might be, I did the following. I went back to the Social Security Annual Statistical Supplement for 1978, which is the first year in Dan's sample. And I calculated that among eligible 62 to 64-year-olds in 1978, 41% had claimed benefits. Okay, so they were beneficiaries. So if we take a roughly 40% take-up rate, we can basically do the scaling here. The 8 percentage point impact that Dan indicated would be rescaled by a factor of 2.5, which is the reciprocal of that 40% take-up rate, and would imply that the earnings test reduces the employment rate of Social Security beneficiaries by 20 percentage points. Okay. If you like Dan's 4 percentage point estimate, the earnings test would reduce the employment rate by 10 percentage points. So we're looking at an impact among beneficiaries, who are the target of the earnings test, of a 10 to 20 percentage point decline in the employment rate. That's a very large impact, okay? And I think that's something that should be really emphasized and given more weight in the paper. Now, among the economists in the room, well, I can be a little bit more technical and say the better way to do this would be to actually run the same specifications that Dan ran, but have claiming as the outcome variable. And this is of interest in and of itself from a policy perspective, because one potential policy concern is that less stringent earnings tests result in earlier claiming. So you could directly address that first. Secondly, you'd essentially be estimating a first stage relationship, and then you could combine that with your reduced form relationship, Dan, and get an exact calculation of the instrumental variable, or what we call treatment on the treated estimates. And that would be quite neat to do. The second thing I'd like to see is that the estimates are done on a set of a sample that has men and women pooled together. And although most of the literature on the earnings test has focused on its impact on men, there's at least some evidence that from the previous studies that men and women respond differently to the earnings test. So I would like to actually see these results broken out separately by sex. That would be interesting. The third thing I'd like to see is some more sensitivity analysis about the definition of the treatment and control groups. Now, the way that I just characterized the randomized controlled trial is a little bit different than what Dan did. I said, imagine you could take some people just above the earnings threshold and just below the earnings threshold. They would be otherwise very similar, identical, but between the two, except for their exposure to the earnings test. That's actually not what Dan and his co-authors do. They do the everyone above the earnings threshold, that's the treatment group, everyone below is the control group. And then they invoke this parallel trends assumption, this standard. And so what would be interesting is to basically marry those two, Dan, and to basically say, look, what happens if we start with the basic estimates where everybody above is in the treatment group and everybody below is in the control group, and then we narrow that to a smaller and smaller band around the threshold. And in order to do this, you need to have large samples. Luckily for Dan and his co-authors, they do. The data here are not just tremendous in the sense that Dan said. These are tremendous administrative data, but they're also tremendously large. He has over 89 million person-year observations on over 9 million individuals. So I think there's probably there's enough data for you to do this without compromising the precision of your estimation. The final thing I would like to see is for those who are interested in methodology, is that what you should take away from this is a technique that does not require any real time series. Okay, it requires panel data, longitudinal data, in order to determine who is in the treatment and control group. But then the comparisons are essentially statically above or below the earnings threshold. So, and that's why it's an interesting solution to a challenging problem when you don't have policy variation. What I would really like to see where this project go is instead of looking at the 1978 to 87 period, I would like to fast forward this to the 2011, 2014, 15 period, where 2014, 15 is about where I think the available SSA data are right now. And in principle, one could do this right now and look at what's the impact of the earnings test in 2014, 2015 with the most current data. I'm almost done, okay? And what one could do it now. It's not that I'm not interested in what happened in 1978 and 1987, but that's a long time ago. I mean, I was young, I had hair, it was dark hair, and let me just add to that, even what we know about the earnings test, the most recent results of the earnings test are based on the 2000 reforms that abolished the earnings test for individuals who are over the full benefit age. And again, that's 17 years old. And given the changes in labor markets in the last 2 decades, I would argue that what we know about the earnings test is now quite dated, especially as it concerns 62 to 64-year-olds. And the other thing about doing this, Dan, about fast forwarding this is that this then allows you to use the W-2 data, which are great, to construct measures of career or lifetime earnings. And then you can start really thinking about how to make different measures of treatment and control groups based on the interaction between current versus lifetime earnings. You could bin people by lifetime earnings and then do it by annual earnings within. There's a lot of permutations and a lot of possibilities. And I think that's a really great direction to go, okay? And in closing, let me say that I really enjoyed this paper, and I look forward to tracing the arc of this research. Thank you very much.